You think a bodyguard is just a huge man in a suit standing next to a rich person? Then you have not yet seen how they actually protect those whose lives are worth billions. For some, it is a sturdy guy at the entrance and a black sport utility vehicle. For others, it is cyber teams, armored trains, locked down cities, presidential limousines costing tens of millions, and budgets that could easily support a small army. Today, we will break down how billionaires, superstars, and world leaders are protected, from Tim Cook and Zuckerberg to Trump, Putin, Modi, and Kim Jong Un. You will hear sums after which even a luxurious life begins to look not like a fairy tale, but like expensive survival. And the craziest part is that the richer and more influential the person, the less freedom they actually have left. Welcome to the channel for the richest.
Luxury life.
The price of peace of mind starts in the millions. Apple disclosed that in 2023, Tim Cook's personal security cost the company $820,309, and another $1.5 million went toward his personal flights. Moreover, the board of directors requires him to fly by private jet for both work and personal trips, precisely for security reasons. That adds up to almost $2.5 million a year, just so that the head of one of the most expensive companies in the world moves within a controlled environment. At Alphabet, the figures are even tougher. In 2024, the company spent $8,200,000 on the personal security of Sundar Pichai, the chief executive officer of Google. This sum included home security, monitoring, a car with a driver, security during travel, and other protective measures. This is no longer a bodyguard. This is a constantly operating infrastructure that does not switch off day or night. Meta has been in a league of its own for years. According to a proxy season review by Harvard Law School, the security expenses for Mark Zuckerberg and his family amounted to around $14 million. When the security of just one family alone costs as much as a fleet of supercars, it is no longer expensive, it is a separate ecosystem. Oracle also did not choose to be modest. In fiscal year 2025, the company allocated $6 million solely for the security of Larry Ellison's primary residence. Not the business, not the office, not all his routes, just the house. A billionaire's home at this level is no longer a dwelling, but an object guarded like a restricted territory. This is where the beautiful talk about luxury ends and the dry mathematics of the ultra-rich begins. If your life is tied to assets worth tens of billions, several million a year on security no longer seems like madness. It is simply insurance against consequences that are far too expensive. Millionaires still play for effect. Billionaires already play defense. For millionaires, security can still be a part of their image. It works not only as protection, but also as a theater of status. When people the size of wardrobes walk beside you, it tells those around you one simple thing: coming too close is not advisable. Floyd Mayweather is one of the most illustrative examples. Sports Illustrated wrote about his security as a wall of huge men who can read a dangerous movement in a crowd in advance. And Reuters separately reported that in 2018, one of his bodyguards was wounded during a shooting at his motorcade in Atlanta. That is to say, it is no longer just a flashy picture. Even for a man who loves to show off his money, security occasionally works in a real threat mode. However, with billionaires, everything changes sharply. There, no one buys muscle for the sake of a stunning photo. There, they buy seconds of reaction time, route checks, undercover employees in the surroundings, access control, room reconnaissance, backup scenarios, and people who think 2 steps ahead. Because while a millionaire is afraid of an obsessive fan, a billionaire is simultaneously afraid of data leaks, route leaks, a strike against the family, political pressure, a cyber breach, and a mistake lasting 5 seconds. When a mansion turns into a problem. The story with Drake's house in Toronto very quickly showed how a luxurious mansion can become not a symbol of success, but a constant headache. In May of 2024, a security guard was wounded at his house, and then within the same week, 2 more separate incidents involving intrusions onto the property occurred. In just a matter of days, one of the most famous houses in Canada became a point of shooting and repeated perimeter breaches. And this is perhaps one of the most accurate examples of how fame works in combination with money. The more famous the person, the faster their address becomes a tourist spot for fans, stalkers, mentally unstable individuals, and those who just want to make headlines at any cost. An ordinary person puts a camera on their fence. A superstar reinforces the perimeter, changes their travel routine, and adds months of work to their security detail. Because a fancy house is wonderful, right up until it becomes a target. Kim Kardashian. One night minus $10 million. There are stories after which the safety rules themselves change across the world of luxury. The robbery of Kim Kardashian in Paris is precisely one such case. In 2016, armed criminals burst into her Paris residence, tied her up, and made off with jewelry worth approximately $10 million. Reuters specifically noted that among the stolen items was a ring worth about $4 million. One evening, one failure. Minus precious items in a sum that could have assembled a whole collection of elite real estate. After such stories, diamonds stop looking like a beautiful detail of an outfit. They become bait, and that is exactly why, among very rich people, security begins to change not only routes, but also behavior. Fewer geotags, fewer real-time publications, fewer spontaneous outings, because when you are literally wearing millions of dollars, at that moment you are no longer a person wearing jewelry, you are a walking safe. Taylor Swift. When a pop star is guarded almost like a state figure, Taylor Swift is no longer just an artist. She is a huge machine with tickets, merchandise, contracts, reputation, and a colossal crowd around every public appearance. In the summer of 2024, 3 of her concerts in Vienna were canceled following a foiled attack. Reuters reported that the police detained suspects, and the security for the London shows was then sharply tightened. At Wembley, it was forbidden to gather near the stadium without tickets, and the concerts themselves took place amid tightened security. The most important thing here is the scale. In Vienna, 65,000 spectators were expected at the show, plus people outside, and at the London concerts, Wembley gathered around 92,000 people per evening. This is no longer just protecting a person at a car. This is protecting a gigantic event, where one mistake can result in mass panic, a reputational crisis, and losses in the tens of millions. This is precisely why, at the level of such superstars, security is not just 2 stern men with earpieces. It is a system. The arena, entrances, streams of people, hotels, backup vehicles, digital threat monitoring, contact with the police, and scenarios for chaos. One stalker is enough to restructure everything. You do not need to be a billionaire to find yourself in a situation where security suddenly becomes the main question of your life. Sometimes it is enough to be very famous, young, and to find yourself in the sights of a person with obsessive behavior. After an incident in Dubai, where a man in the stands exhibited peculiar behavior towards Emma Raducanu during a match, Reuters reported that she was assigned heightened security for the tournament in Indian Wells, and the tennis player later recounted that she could not breathe properly or see the ball due to stress. This is the point where very many stars definitively stop economizing on security, because a stalker is not an abstract threat. It is a specific person who has already come too close. Jeff Bezos. The ultra-rich are no longer afraid of just weapons, but also smartphones. An ordinary rich person thinks about gates, cameras, and an armored car. A super-rich person also thinks about who might sneak into his life through his phone. Reuters, citing independent United Nations experts, reported that they had information indicating the possible involvement of Saudi Arabia in a cyber attack on Jeff Bezos' iPhone via a file sent through WhatsApp. Riyadh denied these accusations, but the story itself showed the main point. At the level of people like Bezos, a smartphone is no longer a gadget, but a potential door to the empire. This is where security makes a sharp turn. It ceases to be solely physical. At this level, protection is also digital counterintelligence, because one hack of a billionaire's phone could prove more expensive than robbing a jewelry store. It is not photos of breakfast in there. It is contacts, routes, closed negotiations, sensitive information, and everything that can change far too much. After the murder of the United Health chief executive officer, the rich became even more nervous. Sometimes a single tragedy is enough for the mindset of the entire corporate elite to change. After the killing of United Healthcare Chief Executive Officer Brian Thompson in December of 2024, Reuters wrote that large companies began to reassess risks for their leaders. They strengthened security, removed photos of top managers from websites, and changed the format of public events. And already in 2025, Reuters reported that corporate America was ramping up such spending even more. United Health itself subsequently disclosed that in 2024, it had spent almost $1.7 million on the security of its executives, and another more than $207,000 went toward the personal and home security of individual members of their families. For the industry, this was a very cold signal, and that means millions spent on the security of chief executive officers are now increasingly perceived not as a whim, but as a forced measure. And this is a very important shift for the topic of luxury. Previously, a viewer saw multi-million-dollar security spending and thought, well, the rich are losing their minds. Now, these sums increasingly look like a reaction to a reality in which a status that is too high makes a person vulnerable, not just on paper. $8.27 million, not on a yacht, but on the ability to live. Alphabet's figure is especially gripping precisely because it is utterly insane from the standpoint of an ordinary life. $8 million a year on security, not on a villa by the ocean, not on a Ferrari collection, not on a jet, on security. This included home security, monitoring, a car with a driver, security consultations, and protection during travel. This is a lifestyle with a built-in security perimeter. If you translate this sum into the language of luxury, it gets even tougher. With that kind of money, you could buy several fancy apartments in Europe, assemble a dream garage, live for years in absolute comfort, and barely glance at the price tags. But in the world of the ultra-rich, this money simply burns up on making one person less accessible. And this is a very accurate description of how the real scale of capital works. First, you buy luxury goods, and then you start buying distance between yourself and the world. $14 million so that no one comes too close. With Zuckerberg, it becomes even more interesting because this is no longer just a rich man. This is one of the most recognizable figures of the digital age, around whom themes of privacy, influence, disinformation, political pressure, and public fury have been swirling for decades. Approximately $14 million on the security of Mark Zuckerberg and his family is a level at which protection ceases to be a service and turns into a separate environment of existence. When one person is linked to a platform hosting billions of users, he automatically becomes a target for far too many dissatisfied people all at once. When just the house is guarded for $6 million a year. An ordinary rich person builds a dream house. A very rich person builds a house and immediately calculates how much its defense will cost. Oracle disclosed that for residential security protection for Larry Ellison in 2025, a budget of $6 million was allocated. Moreover, if the funds prove insufficient, Ellison himself will be the one to cover the overages. And this is logical. A billionaire's house is not just bedrooms, a pool, and an ocean view. There may be art collections, important documents, closed negotiations, family, staff, digital infrastructure, and a heap of information that must not leave the walls. Roman Abramovich, when a yacht resembles a fortress more than a vacation. If there is one symbol that perfectly demonstrates how luxury fuses with defense among the ultra-rich, it is the super yacht. Roman Abramovich's Eclipse was written about for years, not just as a gigantic toy costing hundreds of millions, but as a floating fortress. Forbes called it one of the most expensive yachts in the world, and Wired wrote in detail about its anti-paparazzi laser shield system. The materials also mentioned a mini submarine and 2 helicopter pads. This is precisely the aesthetic of genuine super wealth. You are not just buying a yacht, you are buying an object that looks like a vacation, but in its logic is closer to a high-security closed platform. For an ordinary person, a yacht is the pinnacle of luxury. For a billionaire, a yacht is also control over the space. Who approached by water? Who flew in? Who is filming? Who is nearby? And what is actually happening on board? After the shooting at YouTube, everyone realized that even Silicon Valley is not sterile. In 2018, a shooting occurred at YouTube's headquarters in California. 3 people were wounded. Reuters reported that the attacker was angry at the platform over how it handled her videos. For the technology world, this was a very loud signal. Even the most expensive campuses, where everything looks sterile, comfortable, and safe, can turn into an attack site in seconds. Such cases precisely help explain why companies so easily justify multi-million-dollar spending on executive protection to their shareholders. When the chief executive officer or the founder of a company is worth billions in market capitalization, their security ceases to be merely a personal matter. It becomes a question of business business stability, market resilience, reputation, and risk management.
Even when you love showing off, bullets fly for real.
It is very telling that even in the story of Floyd Mayweather, where security seems to be a part of an expensive show, there's an episode that sharply brings everything back to reality. In 2018, Reuters reported that fire was opened on the boxer's motorcade in Atlanta, and his bodyguard Gregory LaRosa was wounded in the leg. Mayweather was not hurt, but the story matters for a different reason. A crowd of muscular people next to you does not make you invulnerable. It only increases your chances of surviving someone else's decision to pull the trigger. That is to say, even where security looks like a part of the money brand, reality still reminds you of itself in the harshest way. Ostentation, gold, the car fleet, the diamond-studded watches, all of that looks very beautiful right up until the moment your convoy starts being shot at. The presidential level, when security costs as much as a small war. If a billionaire's protection resembles a private intelligence service, at the presidential level, a different genre begins, a state one. In the United States, the overall Secret Service budget alone in the budget project for the 2025 fiscal year is proposed at a level of $2.9 billion. And separately within it, $70 million were earmarked for the security of the presidential campaign and inauguration. This is no longer bodyguards. This is a huge federal machine. Protection for the president, vice president, their families, the White House, the vice president's residence, and foreign leaders during visits. And even the presidential car here long ago ceased to be just a car. Reuters wrote that the new version of the American presidential limousine, the Beast, debuted in 2018 as a heavily armored vehicle, and in 2025, the Secret Service issued General Motors a contract for $14.8 million to develop the next generation of the Beast, with the total program cost potentially rising to $40.8 million by 2029. That means just the next American presidential limousine alone costs as much as an entire fleet of supercars, and that is still without counting the planes, communications, cover groups, and the entire motorcade. Vladimir Putin, protection costing trillions. But if American protection is a very expensive open state system, in Vladimir Putin's case, everything is arranged almost in reverse. Extreme secrecy, a minimum of precise numbers, and an enormous amount of classified information. Reuters outright wrote that Russia's budget for 2025 through 2027 became the most secretive in post-Soviet history, and defense spending in 2025 rose to 13.5 trillion rubles. $150 billion. While trillions were similarly allocated to national security. Against such a backdrop, the exact expenses specifically for presidential protection are almost dissolved within the classified line items. That is to say, Putin's level of security is so opaque that the very absence of numbers already says a great deal. Moreover, the security contour around Putin is not simply bodyguards with radios. Materials about Kremlin personnel reshuffles reminded that the Federal Protection Service is headed by a structure under Dmitry Kochnev, and former members of Putin's presidential security detail regularly move on to very high positions. The most vivid example is Alexei Dyumin, a former bodyguard of Putin's, who was first made a governor and then promoted to one of the key positions in the power system. That is to say, in the Russian model, the security detail of the head of state is not a service staff, it is a part of the very core of power. Narendra Modi, security that can shut down a whole city. The Prime Minister of India is protected by the Special Protection Group, an elite structure of direct protection for top state figures. In 2024, roughly $60.5 million were allocated to it. That is approximately 5.06 billion rupees at the average exchange rate of 2024. So Modi does not just have security, he has a separate state machine with its own large budget. The true scale is visible at events like the G20. During the summit in New Delhi in 2023, the city was guarded by about 130,000 security personnel, and anti-drone systems were used to cover against potential attacks. This is already a level where they protect not just the person, but the entire city around them. Routes, rooftops, the airspace, approaches, and the perimeter. The Indian model is particularly interesting because it is expensive not for show, but according to a logic of total control. For such events, the leaders were transported in 20 armored limousines, and just the rental of this fleet cost around $2.18 million. That is, a single international summit easily turns the security budget into the price tag of a small luxury collection. Dozens of armored vehicles, sealed-off roads, a dense cordon, and a city operating as one large security object. Kim Jong Un, when security becomes a part of a power cult. Under Kim Jong Un, the protection looks not just harsh, but demonstrative. The most famous footage is of bodyguards running alongside his limousine during overseas summits. Reuters described that in Vietnam in 2019, about 12 bodyguards ran next to Kim's car. This is no longer just security, it is a public signal. The leader moves inside a human shield. But even more interesting is his transport. For international trips, Kim often chooses his green armored train. Reuters wrote that this format is needed not for the visual image, but for the sake of security, comfort, and the ability to carry a large accompaniment contingent. Security, aids, communications, provisions, and everything needed for a completely isolated journey. In essence, it is not a train but a moving protected residence. A billionaire has a jet. Kim has an entire armored train, inside which one can live and hold meetings. As for his cars, there too the level is almost absurdly expensive. Reuters wrote that Putin gifted Kim an Urus, a Russian presidential limousine, and Kim himself has already appeared in a Maybach, a Mercedes limousine, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, and a Lexus sport utility vehicle. That means his car fleet looks like a set of vehicles not just for a very rich man, but for the head of an ultra-closed regime where security and status must merge into a single image. In this lies the whole specificity of Kim Jong Un. There is no nice, transparent budget figure here, as with India or the United States, but there is something else. Maximum isolation, fully sealed-off routes, an armored train instead of regular flights, limousines inside a ring of bodyguards, and logistics built to reduce unpredictability almost to zero. The higher the status, the more expensive it is. Not the luxury, but the inaccessibility. Millionaires buy security, billionaires buy a system, and presidents already live inside a whole state security machine. And after all these figures, it becomes clear. The most expensive luxury in the world is not a yacht, not a jet, and not a palace, but the ability to remain unreachable. Write in the comments what you think about this and subscribe to the channel for the richest. Here it is all about luxury, wealth, and the lives of the most influential people on the planet.